somewhere in Boston. Hopefully got out of the hotel. Okay. So how many people made their 2 connections, have 2 emails? All right. I've been following the Twitter feed, and it definitely looks like everyone's had a great time and made some great connections. So we are on to day 3, and this is the second of the plenary sessions, and I'm really excited about this one. I think one of the things we were challenged by Lewis when his presentation, he talked about the zone of wishful thinking, which I know many of us sometimes find ourselves in. And I actually see that this session has an opportunity to help us figure out what are the methods and what are the tools that can help move us through the zone of wishful thinking. And so today we're fortunate to have with us combination of people, but the focus of this, let me first give you the topic. The topic is towards common research methods, perspectives on researching youth longitudinal program participation. And in thinking about what to do in this session, I remember about, I guess, as we were the first implementation grant that MacArthur had, and one of our goals was to say, well, while we're going to do all this work, creating these interventions, we really need to have alongside us some research partners who can really help us understand what's going on, such that we can be able to turn on a dime if necessary as we're understanding what's happening and change our model. In doing that, I just learned so much about the need for collaborative partnerships, and also the need for thinking very critically about the research tools we use, and also the representation of the research data we have, such that it's not only valuable at the end state for the summative, but it's also very much valuable for researchers and practitioners in the act of doing the work. So when asked to chair DML, one of the most important things for me was to make sure that we had an opportunity to bring some of the researchers into the conversation who have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort really understanding how to craft tools and representations that are valuable for practitioners. So today we have with us Brigid Barron, I guess my colleague in crime for multiple years. Brigid's at Stanford, who's going to talk about the work that she's done for years in trying to create such representations. Vera Michalchik, who everyone knows Vera and all the work she's done with Computer Clubhouse and the work when she was at SRI, who's really been a trailblazer in helping to think about these types of methodologies. And then we were able to rope in Bill Penuel, who's now at Boulder, who has also done a lot of work in working with the DML Hub and trying to help us think about these methods. And Craig Watkins, who sits in this hybrid, both as a program developer and creator, but also has spent a lot of time thinking about the research and how do you actually represent the research in ways that are useful for colleagues. So some of the questions I sort of put to the speakers, as you see them here, is really for us to think about how can research tools inform practice, and understanding what's the timing, because oftentimes you can collect the data, but how do we really think about the timing of how we give back our representations of data in such a way that you as program developers and designers can use that data to change our practice? The last thing we want is to hear at the end that, oh, this is some useful data that you can do something with. How do we think about what our relationships are in such a way that we work together? How do we make sure that we're understanding the impact of our work on students, on student learning? And then really, how do we think critically about the ways in which are there dangers in the types of outcomes and in publishing outcomes maybe too early? So I'm really excited about the conversations that's going to take place, and Brigid is first up. Brigid.
Thank you. It's really exciting to be here. Oops, the slides are not moving. Oh, we already have a little technical difficulty. Let's see if I can start this over again. Nope, it's not moving. Caitlin, do you have any idea? This is your computer. My computer, we just switched from since my hard drive was full, a metaphor. Oh. Do we have one up that's on presenter view and one?
No, we just couldn't get it.
Okay, it's cool. So anyway, it's a very exciting time to be studying learning. There's so much interest and passion around designing new kinds of learning environments for out-of-school spaces and for spaces that can connect with schools and other institutions. At the same time, it's a really complicated venture that we face, in part because there's so much heterogeneity in the out-of-school space that it's very difficult to even have the language to describe these different learning environments that we're creating so rapidly. And this presents an interesting challenge when it comes to funders and to stakeholders who might want to know, well, what's happening in terms of learning in these varied spaces? And so today, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that we did with Nichole and have those issues in mind as we move forward and talk about the complexity and the opportunity of what together we are confronting in terms of the opportunities for innovation. So I'm glad that Nichole raised the question about timing of research and timing of reports. I'm going to talk a little bit about our book. I'm going to follow our book structure, in fact, and I want to note that it's actually been 8 years since we started our project. We were able to do research for 3 years, but then it took another many years to actually create a document that summarizes the complexity of what we found. And so I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind. So the book starts by trying to set a broader context for thinking about why is it important to provide learning opportunities that engage young people in creating with technology. It's the case that schools are inconsistently providing these kinds of opportunities. We know that more affluent schools and schools that have networks of people who are connected with technical industries are more likely to provide experiences that engage young people in innovation and design. And we know that in schools that are less affluent, often computing is used more for assessment or testing or maybe not at all. And so what happens is those young people who are learning tend to be learning through their social networks at home, through opportunities like the ones that you're providing, but it's not very systematic. And so as we look at the data, we see these very clear connections between our old tried and true variables of socioeconomic status and gender, and that's problematic. Even within what Craig has called innovation hubs. So Craig Watkins has been studying learning in the context of the Austin community. My group has spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley trying to understand equity issues. And even in a place where literally in the air you've got tons of technical language and innovation and models, we see huge differences in the opportunities that young people have with consequences for how they come to see themselves as part of that innovative society. So I'm going to talk today about some findings from our work. We began with this exciting opportunity to collaborate with Nichole in a place that is trying to untangle those stubborn correlations between socioeconomic status, parent jobs, and opportunities to learn. And so we were thrilled to have a chance to see what happens when you have such a rich learning ecology that's designed. So as many of you know, DYN is an incredibly creative model that's a hybrid model that spans the school day in a required media arts class, after school elective pods or clubs where children could choose whether they wanted to focus on robotics or movie making or graphic design, among other things. An online space where there was an opportunity outside of the time of being in school to contribute to a community, to get feedback on one's work, also populated by mentors that the young people knew face to face, so they had real ongoing relationships with them. And then a key part of this was laptops that young people could bring home. So that laptop became a bridge to connect the different spaces of their lives where they could keep their projects and they could keep revising them and designing with them. So the collaboration also provided a unique opportunity to connect research and practice. So we didn't want, and Nichole absolutely did not want, researchers to be totally separate from the endeavor of design. So really, we were actually in there giving feedback all the time and subtly shaping what was happening. As we saw things emerge in the field, Nichole and her team would be responding to them and changing. At the same time, we were having new questions occur to us as researchers as we saw what was happening. The funding from MacArthur and later NSF was really critical in supporting this work. On this next slide, you see the distributed team that we had. We had researchers that were in Chicago on the ground. We had a team of researchers in California. We had actually, some of our team members were in Germany and other places during the time of the project. And then we had the DYN design team. And so having this opportunity to have dialogue for 3+ years around data was really, really important. We were able to, I think, develop a lot of collaborative capacity that we would not have if we didn't have that sustained focus of attention and opportunity and, of course, commitment. Again, I just want to point out that I really see this work as use-inspired research. It's basic research, but it's also practice research. And we see these interrelated in the work so that we're constantly trying to shape practice, but we're also trying to make our theories of learning more complicated and more useful and more relevant and more true in some sense. So our work had a dual analytic focus. We wanted to look at both the environment that was created and what was happening there. And as I tried to start talking about, environments are incredibly difficult to characterize, right? In the DYN environment, you have this amazing group of mentors who were young people with their own portfolios of work who were coming in and being able to form really interesting relationships, but they also were doing lots of things like creating workshops and contests and forums and small groups and signature projects where young people could do a film over a few weeks. So there was a lot going on there. And then we also, so we wanted to capture that, like what's happening in the environment, but then we also want to know what's happening with the learners. We wanted to be able to capture their unique ways of developing through the opportunities that they had. And we wanted to understand the choices that they were making and start to conceptualize, like if we're going to expand beyond standardized test scores as a measure of learning, what kinds of things can we look at? So our methodology and design, we had multiple methods that we used. So we were doing field work. So the Chicago team on the ground every day, they were in the classrooms, in the pods, and online trying to take notes, trying to understand and document what was happening. We also used that data in part to enhance our case portraits. We had a longitudinal cohort, so we were able to follow the whole group of about 50 students for 3 years, 6th grade to 8th grade. And then we were also focused in, and that was with quantitative metrics, focused in on individuals and the detailed ways that across the settings of their lives, they were bringing in what they were learning and contributing back to the community. And that's where it gets really interesting and really complicated. So I'm going to spend some time talking about those pathway studies. And then we also want to do a comparative study, right? So in the end, are we bridging divides in terms of access to learning opportunities? And is there anything we can say about what happened here relative to children who might have more technical access at home, and the sample we drew on was a local one in Silicon Valley. So we had 2 samples here, one at DYN, it's a charter school, economically diverse. A few of the parents had high-tech jobs. They were very involved parents, but not necessarily with high-tech jobs. There was the blended arts program, the laptop program. In the Silicon Valley sample that I was able to recruit, we had a bigger group of 8th graders, the whole school, 358 of them. They were economically more homogeneous, with few students receiving any kind of reduction in lunch price. Many parents, however, were in the tech industry. In fact, about 70% of the fathers were directly involved in the tech industry in a creative kind of role. They didn't have any technology classes. Everything was happening at home. It was a very traditional school. So what did we measure? So we tried to measure over time 3 different clusters of things. Experience and expertise, and we did that through measuring project activity, through their familiarity with technical language, and their confidence with specific professional tools. We wanted to look at identity as a creator, so we wanted to look at their sense of themselves as someone who could generate ideas, who saw themselves as creative. We wanted to look at the extent to which they thought in the future they might make media that would be useful for change. And we wanted to look at their willingness to use technology to express themselves personally. And then the third cluster was social learning orientation. So we're really, really interested in this piece of, do you share what you've learned with other people in your family or in your community? And so we tried to come up with some measures for looking at that. So first finding, I'm going to go pretty quickly here. Everybody learns, okay? So I'm just showing one measure here. But in terms of our measures of expertise, which spanned 3 different kinds of ways of looking, you see that in general from 6th to 8th grade, everyone is acquiring breadth of expertise, they're acquiring more technical language, they're developing more confidence with the tools that they've been exposed to. So that is fabulous. Second, at the end of 8th grade, the DYN students were actually more experienced than the students in Silicon Valley on a couple of the measures. So one, on that project experience measure, they had a greater breadth and depth of experience than the students in Silicon Valley. Second, they also felt more confident with the tools that we asked about. So things like Flash and GarageBand, and we have a whole host of tools that we asked about. And so those DYN 8th graders felt like they could use those tools, and some expert enough that they felt like they could teach other people. There were no differences on a couple of other measures, one of them being a measure of familiarity with technical language. So terms like malware, phishing, HTML, PDF, there were no differences, in a slight advantage, but not significant for the students in Silicon Valley. Again, suggesting that there's in the air things that they're learning. The third finding that I want to spend the most time on is this finding of variability within DYN, because this, I think, is so fascinating, and I think it's where we have to go in terms of conceptualizing how we start to think about understanding how any one particular program influences young people. So what we found, yes, everybody learned, but when we looked at the depth of experience with these different production activities, like making movies, doing robotics, creating websites, we found huge differences, right? So some students got really, really, really into the production activities and they became quite expert, and others were more likely to explore a little bit, dabble a little bit, and not get very experienced with production activities. And what's really important to note here is that there's no association at all with standardized test scores, with family income, or with gender, those demographic variables that so often tend to be correlated with things. So this raises some really interesting questions, right? So how do we understand this variability within, and then how do we even try to make sense of whether it makes a difference and what we might do from it? So So here's a question that we posed and that we write about in the book. Does depth of experience matter? And this gets to the more general question, does making and creating matter? And I think that many of us in this room assume that it does, right? It's a kind of a digital hobby that involves design and problem solving and thinking and developing a lot of troubleshooting and expertise, and it can take a long time. But we don't necessarily have a lot in our evidence base that says that it matters. So we wanted to look at that. So we found several things. We found that the depth of expertise was related also to a feeling of expertise with those tools that we asked about. We found that those students who got deep into their projects had greater familiarity with technical language. They were also more likely to share their technical knowledge with others. So we looked at the network size in terms of who they were teaching in family, community, friends. And then they also had higher confidence in their capacity to collaborate with others. And this is something that's a really interesting issue to talk about. You know, what does it mean to collaborate as a young person and what challenges come up? Because we saw that a lot. But those young people that had more project experience felt more like they would be successful in the future if they were put in a collaborative group. A number of other benefits. So I should have made these labels bigger. So we found several different kinds of benefits that are graphed here. And the first one, I'm just going to make this a little bigger on my side here. Is actually being able to, my eyesight must be going. Feels creative, thank you. To bring the screen closer. You saw the young people who had more depth of experience were more likely to endorse strongly that they felt like they could come up with interesting ideas or be creative. So that has a couple of items in it. Okay, the second one here, I need collaboration. Explore interests. So those young people who had created a greater variety and a deeper set of projects also were more likely to endorse items that said, I feel like I can explore my identity and my interests online in ways that I cannot with people that I know. Putting quality work, thank you so much, putting quality work up is something that we were interested in looking at. So when you post something, are you thinking about how it's representing you and other people? And so do you try to make sure that what you post is of a quality that you feel proud of? And the next one I can actually read. So making media for social change. And this is really very, very consistent with the broader DYN goals. Many of the mentors themselves modeled and engaged young people in discussions about politics and how do we think about media being a tool for social change. And so we saw that those young people who had more projects also were more likely to say that in the future they might do this themselves. And then finally, bi-directional teaching-learning relationships. So I mentioned that we look at the teaching network. Well, it's also possible to look at, do you have relationships where you're both a teacher and a learner? And we think that these relationships are actually very interesting and productive because it suggests that your relationship offers the ability to explain to somebody, to feel like an expert, but also to share back. Okay. So the fourth cluster of findings, dynamics of pathways over time. So we want to begin to account for this variability and just try to understand what's happening in terms of young people's choices to go deep or not. And we also want to begin to conceptualize how learning is connected across settings. And I know the whole Connected Learning Network is very focused on this. So we were interested in trying to conceptualize categories of ways that we saw movement occurring across setting and across time. And we found 3 in particular: creating projects, recruiting support from mentors, and sharing expertise with the family and community. And I'll share an example of that. But I want to spend just a minute talking about, how do we think about these biographical methods? It's time consuming to do this. It takes a lot of people if you're going to do it well, right? You want to have multiple kinds of data. So we wanted to have observations from the field, but we also wanted to have artifacts from the young people themselves. We wanted to have young people explain to us how they were thinking about creating these artifacts, why they created these artifacts, what they got out of it. So we did artifact-based interviews. We were also interested in their broader learning across settings. So we had learning ecology interviews that we did multiple times over the 3-year period. We also wanted to have people who were important to these young people give us their perspective. So mentors and parents also shared with us. And then we involved mentors in jointly constructing maps with us. I hope that many of you got to see the presentation that Caitlin gave yesterday, focusing really on these pathway maps, and I'll show you one. But the way that those get constructed, right, literally we have tons of data, and then creating on paper and pencil what we see in terms of activities and how they cross time and boundaries and social networks. And so the photograph on the bottom there is showing one of the mentors engaged with us, correcting our map, adding to our map, elaborating what we had seen. So the other nice thing about having a broad range of data, so we have the quantitative data and then we have these maps, is we can start having the two become into conversation with one another, right? So often we focus a lot on quantitative test scores and things like that, and we lose the person. On the other hand, if you just have case study data, right, we often are given feedback that we just have stories, that we don't have any way of actually understanding what that means for anybody else. And so what we have tried to do in this work is to have the case studies be in conversation with the quantitative data, and what you see here is just a mapping of distribution of the number of young people and the number of projects they went into in depth, and then we have case studies from different young people. So we can start to say, let's look at Michael, who didn't have many projects. What was going on with him? Let's look at other young people who have a lot and see what was happening with them. The basic story, and this is a complicated story, is that variability, there's not one reason, right? And those of you who work with young people can relate to this, I am sure, right? There are unique friendship groups. There are unique topical interests. There are unique preferences that somebody has for the kinds of activity, whether it's tinkering or movie making or content. There are families that are involved in deciding what kinds of activities young people are going to be doing and how much time they get to spend. And so there was not one kind of explanation. Instead, it's very multidimensional, and I think that itself can be an interesting design principle that we think about, how we design for this variety. So I'm going to just give a quick example. So Maurice, he was somebody that had many projects that he deeply got involved with. The quote here, he says, "I saw myself in a lot of different ways as an inventor and as a student activist." And this is indeed true. He had a broad portfolio of work, including podcasts, digital videos, digital music, social networking site that he created, and he did a documentary about Reverend Wright, among other things. So his website that he created, which he really attributes very, very much to his sole activity, but if we're going to do an analysis, we know that there were a lot of ideas going into it. He called it Realm of New Thought. So he described Realm of New Thought's purpose in this way. It's a little bit different. It's sort of to meet friends and to have fun and play games online. But the main purpose is to give teens a way to talk about and express their feelings about things other than things you might not find in a normal conversation, like politics, the economy, things like that. And so that's the goal of Realm of New Thought. You try and make a realm of new thought. That's how ours is different. That's how it stands out. And that was at the end of 7th grade. And he goes on and he talks about the broader goals. The reason why I made this website is because I wanted to change how people think. And I wanted to open up people's minds into a 21st century era. And I wanted to have like a community online where people could discuss ideas. Now, of course, we know there's a lot of mirroring actually in the Remix site itself, but he wanted to create his own. And so how do we think about this project in relation to this idea of pathways? So the notion of pathways is actually, we could talk about that for hours, right? Is this a pathway that we're seeing? Or is it, more like, I think John Seeley Brown talked about, kayaking a wild river, right? It's a young person who's coming up with their own projects and pulling in whatever ideas they feel like are important to bring in. And what we have mapped here across time are the number of projects that we considered learning-rich activities. And so that website, when I put a star on it, would be an example of creating a personal project. It started in the pod, perhaps, but it really had a life of its own, and he did it at home. He saw it as his thing, not anybody else's thing. But then it led to a couple of interesting new opportunities, which I would call the small moves that sustain learning. So he tried to get peers to help, and he did. So he recruited collaborators, and then he also got support from mentors and got feedback from teachers and from parents. And then what this led to, right, is people recognizing his expertise. He actually decided to learn a little bit of HTML, and he would carry a book around, and he was invited to give a workshop to teachers. And so that in and of itself, right there is a pretty consequential move for a young person to be all of a sudden, as in 8th grade, to be asked to address people who have been teaching you for years, as well as a broader group of teachers. And so he was able to share his knowledge there. So I'm running out of time, and I just want to end in a couple of different ways. One, we try not to just present these visual pathways. They are really, we consider them sort of intermediate representations that help theory building. Nichole has found them really useful for design. We hope they're useful for practitioners, but they're very complicated. We also try to think about narrative representation. So stories that are more in words. So in the book, we include 4 of these, and we try to connect the 2 kinds of representation. And the narrative allows you to include more point of view of the learner and other people around the learner to really try to bring in these multiple perspectives and feelings. Again, we try to relate them to quantitative data, but we also in the future want to think about them as potentially helpful for practitioners as a way to think about even expanding their own repertoire of how they think about working with young people. So just, what do we think we can say from all of this? One, I think it's clear that, depth and breadth of experience with production matters. I think that this book and the evidence in it adds to other work that's starting to show relationships, not necessarily with standardized test scores, but with things like choices to learn more, using networked resources, identifying oneself as an idea generator or as creative, the likelihood of sharing your expertise and teaching others, which leads then to other kinds of opportunities like consulting. And then we do have some emerging findings that coming out of dissertation work that these kinds of measures are actually predicting how well people learn in a new setting, like learning computer science programming language. And so we think that that's exciting to see as well. And it helps us, I think, as a field, start to be able to provide some evidence for the importance of the work that we're doing as we help young people learn to create and build. So the findings that we offered here suggest metrics that go beyond test scores and near-term knowledge gains, but I think this is a wide open area, and we need to think collectively about how to expand our repertoires of assessment. And then the variability that we saw suggests to me that we need to keep the research and documentation detailed and nuanced. We need to think about expanding our units of analysis. And I know this is even getting more complicated, but it's not just the learners who are learning. So at DYN, the mentors were learning at the same time. Families were learning at the same time. It's complicated, I think, to think about how to do this, but I think this is an important direction. So it's not just the unit of analysis of the learner that we need to look at. We want to be looking at the ensembles of people that they are learning with and across. Making our tools relevant to practice, I think, is also core and key. I had a conversation at a meeting organized by Bill and Chris Gutierrez a couple weeks ago, and we were talking a lot about this issue of assessment, and this woman, Emmeline, who's a designer, director, and informal educator, and I asked her, I said, well, what kind of tools do you think would, like, what do you want? And she said, I want tools that help directors advocate for a program. She said, I want tools that help educators speak with confidence in their own words about the benefits they are seeing. And she gave me examples of key educators in communities that themselves may not have more than an 8th grade education, but they are playing essential roles as brokers and teachers and supporters of young people. She wants tools that they can use to communicate all the different things that they're seeing. And then finally, she said tools that help educators improve their own practice. So I think that these are wonderful goals for all of us to try to think about and actually look at our own tools and say, do they help and how, or why might they not? So just to close, I want to close paying tribute to my colleague and friend Elliot Eisner, who I'm not sure exactly if he borrowed this from Einstein or if it morphed in his own way, but not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that is measured matters. And I think that as we go forward with this project of trying to figure out how do we provide evidence for the really powerful learning that occurs, it's a good thing to keep in mind. Thank you. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Vera. Oh dear.
All right, thank you. Thank you so, is this working? Yeah? Okay, good. Thank you so much, Brigid. I just love the richness and complexity that you laid out, and the opening comments, Nichole, that you provided were really helpful. And maybe the thing I loved most were those comments from the woman Emmeline that Brigid just cited, who really talked about why we should be doing research and why we should be paying attention to what's happening actively and documenting what's happening in our sites. And it's important to note that there were three very different kinds of things. The first one was really about showing the worth of programs. The next one was about giving confidence to practitioners in terms of what they understand about their programming. And the third one, I think, was improving programming, right? Did I do a good job of remembering what they were? But I really think we have to recognize that those are three pretty different functions for research, and in these conversations there's a lot of conflation about why we do it, but I think we always need to keep in mind the why of why we want to go out and document, measure, assess, evaluate, and do these other things that take a lot of resources and take a lot of resources, and ultimately they direct where we head and they shape our programming, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. So perspectives on research, I want to thank my colleagues Larry Gallagher, Tim Podkul, and Denise Sauerteig. Tim and Denise are here, and and they all helped with this a bit. Among the purposes we have for getting together this morning, I think one of the key ones is really to lay out some considerations for when we do this research, things that we should be concerned about, and things that, that really make it possible for us to do the kind of research that matters and is congruous with the kinds of work we're doing as people working in the field of connected learning. I'm going to try to highlight what I believe we should be concerned with as we move forward with our research. And I'm going to do this in no small part by talking about the work that my colleagues at SRI and I have done working with the Computer Clubhouse over the last decade or so. And it's been a great decade. We've learned a lot, but there are a lot of other things for us to learn and do and to pay attention to as we move forward. I think if I were to sum it up, and I will sum it up, I think there are two things that we want to do. We want to think about what it is we need to worry about and what it is we need to strive for, and my thinking plays off a lot of what Luis Gomez was talking about in his keynote on Thursday, that ultimately the goal of our research should be, and this adds to the list of goals that our friend Emmeline described, but the goal of our research should be an elaboration of discourse about what we're doing and what our programs are doing, elaborating the kinds of practices that exist within the system so that others can clearly see these routines and practices, and especially in all their variety and their diversity. And there's a big question about the relationship between the kinds of measures that we use in our work and how that affects diversity and variety. He talked about, I think, characteristic kinds of excellence and unusual kinds of excellence, and that we're always operating, or always should be operating, with a sensitivity to situational, contextual factors and the nuances in those. So that's, I think the biggest picture of all is how we maintain those things when we pursue our research. I was going to give some background on the Clubhouse, the Computer Clubhouse network, and our friend Danielle Martin from the network pointed out that there were 9 sessions here that focused on the model, and many people in the audience have been busy over the last 20 years, actually, designing, studying, and implementing the model. So I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm going to give a little bit of background, just a quick run through. So 1993, first Clubhouse opened. It eventually ended up it started at the MIT Media Lab, eventually ended up at the Museum of Science in Boston. In 1998, the Village was launched, an online community that really aligns with a lot of the principles of connected learning as we have developed and elaborated them since then. In 2000, Intel became a sponsor of the network itself that allowed resources to be used in supporting the collection of clubhouses that were growing and growing and growing, with the intent that there would be 100 internationally by the year within a few years. And in 2003, that goal was reached. There were 100 worldwide, almost. And Intel celebrated its 10th, the Clubhouses celebrated their 10th anniversary. And it's also the year we started working with the network. By 2005, there were 100 clubhouses, and there was a 20-year celebration of the anniversary. There was a 10-year celebration. I'm getting my numbers mixed up. Sorry, not enough sleep last night. But there was a celebration of the opening of the 100th clubhouse in Washington, D.C. Okay. Bad run through, but you get the general gist. I think really important for us is that the principles of the Clubhouse and the way it's operated really align well with what has developed as the connected learning model. You can see here learning by design, following interests, building a community, and fostering respect and trust. By 2003, the Clubhouse, the network itself, had worked with many different researchers and organizations to really do some of the things that Luis was talking about, to elaborate the model and to really look at issues of implementation and sustainability as they affected the Clubhouse. But they were asked by funders to look at outcomes, and they wanted evidence regarding what youth were learning. They were asked questions that I think many organizations here are asked, and they were asked to come up with the kinds of findings that I think a lot of you are asked to provide, and that's how does your program impact youth? In this case, it was how does the Clubhouse impact youth? And the way this question gets framed typically is essentially a psychological one that makes certain assumptions about the nature of learning and development. We spent a long time talking with Clubhouse leaders and practitioners back then, and Bill Penuel was part of that original work. And we made a long list of the kinds of ways that the clubhouses might change members based on their participation. Ways like they become more knowledgeable or skillful, more confident or cooperative, more connected, more resilient, and such things. We reviewed dozens and dozens of existing instruments, and these instruments generally had good psychometric properties, reliability and validity in some contexts. Now, I'm going to just say a little bit about validity, that some people think of validity as having to do with whether or not the thing that you're trying to measure, the construct, really exists. Things like interest and bonding to school. And a big one these days has been activation, but it may make more sense to think about how you know it when you see it. How do you know that such a thing as interest exists in behavioral and observable terms? And one of the concerns that we have, and I think this community has, and is trying to make sure we get on the table and don't lose sight of, is that if your construct, something like interest, is observable as a disposition towards future behaviors, it raises some questions about how much you should be trying to measure that construct in the here and now, and what the ways you have to measure that construct, and importantly, whether the thing you're trying to measure is the same or different across contexts, especially when you are looking at programs in the wild and not controlling them, which of course Brigid did in her study. But we typically call that kind of research and the concerns that come with it ecological, having to do with the projects or the research's ecological validity. So just given that background, when we were doing the work with the Clubhouse back in 2003, what we came up with, this youth impact survey, we had a bunch of constructs. They included collaboration, relationships with adults, a sense of belonging, a sense of the future, social competence, and a whole bunch of academic outcomes that we went after as well, grades and years in school, and aspirations in relation to schooling, and then ask kids about their technological engagement in the programs. We piloted the original instrument with 168 kids, and I want to highlight this because we had 170 questions on that instrument, something that I would absolutely never do again to a child. I traveled around the state and sat with kids, massaged their shoulders. We took breaks. It was the most one-on-one intensive thing I might have ever done in my life, but we got 168 kids to respond to that questionnaire so that we could do a factor analysis and reduce the number of questions down to about 58. And we've changed them a little bit over time and modified them, but we've been administering this questionnaire, this survey, internationally since 2005, and we found all sorts of interesting things. For different scales, by different scales, many and most are actually statistically significant, and we see things like the amount of time. I have the glasses problem, Brigid. The amount of time, even though I have glasses on, that kids spend overall in the Clubhouse varies with their overall academic success. So the more time kids are spending in the Clubhouse, the better they report their academic outcomes are. So there's a correlational factor there. There's also a correlation between their overall socio-emotional scores, that is, the median socio-emotional scores, that is, factors like sense of belonging and such, with the time they spend in the Clubhouse, the duration of time they spend in the Clubhouse. But you'll note that these are correlational studies, and correlation, of course, is not causation. We don't know whether they stayed 3 or more hours because of a deep sense of belonging, or because they stayed 3 or more hours, they deepened their sense of belonging. Excuse me, I didn't want to go ahead yet. We'd like to think there's probably a mutually reinforcing dynamic cycle. That is, that kids that stay longer have a deeper sense of belonging, and kids, even if they've come with a relatively high sense of belonging when they originally arrived. So we're happy because of that. We're happy with the result because of that. we hoped to get kids to take the survey repeatedly over years, and we didn't get that. It would have allowed us to make some inferences about how these constructs, how kids change over time, but getting kids to take this survey really proved difficult. Getting the same kids to take it repeatedly proved difficult. Ultimately, when you're asking about these sorts of studies where you want to get outcomes that you can use to prove to people that want proof that the program is working, you probably want to have a comparative study. And I know that Lewis talked quite a bit about RCTs and how much pressure there is to conduct those in the field. In a lot of cases, as you know, and especially when we're talking about the kinds of programs that we're developing here, there's rarely something comparable in the community. And when we think about diversity of programming, that really echoes strongly here. We really are talking about unique kinds of programming, and the difficulty of comparing this to something else that exists or creating a comparable condition really becomes a problem for doing comparative studies. It's also difficult to assign youth to programs when the study is a matter of choice. To geek out a little bit, you can possibly go with a delayed treatment model where you randomly assign kids so that you get some in the program early and others wait, but then you have the problem of tracking the kids who didn't show up in the program, and you also have some ethical problems. We could probably use similar sites, like similar clubhouses, and look at different kinds of programming one place or the other in a mini experiment of sorts. But overall, these programs, as I tried to say before, are pretty costly. And for the work we did with the Clubhouse, there were real constraints in terms of the resources that were available. And I'm always quite aware that those costs typically are in direct conflict with the kinds of resources that get put into programming. So Thursday, some people after the opening session and I were talking, and they were really expressing their concerns about the cost of the kinds of experimental studies that funders typically want. And they also worry that once you have the kinds of measures that people are asking us to apply, that in the wild they can turn up nothing. They can, and Brigid referred to sort of more traditional assessments quite a bit, they can turn up nothing because you're measuring the wrong thing, because of the diversity of programs. And because of the diversity of programs, you don't necessarily have a reasonable comparative outcomes across site, because the nature of the program is quite different and the outcomes really aren't similar. So again, programs can lack that ecological validity we talked about before. Now I think people of every stripe can agree that it makes sense to look at what kids produce, what they show they can do as a result of their participation. And being in the conference thus far, we've seen amazing examples of what kids can do. On Thursday, I was in the session where Phonar was presenting, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the name, but some of the products that were created by Phonar were presented, and their media artworks that are absolutely stunning. And you ask yourself, would kids be able to create those works of art without something like that program? And the answer is probably not. Would they have experiences like those that are available at makerspaces and other connected learning kinds of environments, the kinds of places that we're talking about studying? And the answer is probably not. So even though it makes a lot of sense to consider the kinds of evidence that stakeholders want when they ask us if kids are learning, I think we're at an important moment culturally and historically when we're operating with two cultural models, and I think it's sort of an inflection point where there's one that really thinks that traditional modes of didactic transmissionist learning really are right, and they're what experts sanction, and they're still legitimated in most of the institutional settings that we work in and operate in. And there are a lot of pressures regarding what we show as outcomes in our programming, but there's also that other thing, the thing that people, parents, people who work with youth, they recognize engagement, they recognize joy and excitement in kids when they see it, and they see their kids' eyes shining and understand that there are other possibilities and other options for learning. And I think what it does is put us in the position to really make salient the nature of those kinds of programming. And I think that's where Lewis's discussion went a great deal on Thursday. And it also pushes us to think holistically about people's life histories and trajectories. Brigid has done more work, and I think the most masterful work in the area thinking about life histories. In relation to the Clubhouse, we did a small study. It was called A Place to Be Your Best. And I think what was interesting about that study was we got out to some sites, but it was almost exclusively done from documentation that was provided by practitioners, provided by Clubhouse coordinators in their annual reports, by participants in the Clubhouse, youth that had graduated out, and alumni. And going through that documentation, poring through it, we tried to abstract some of the key themes and the key ways that the Clubhouse, really the design principles for how the Clubhouse worked. For those for whom it worked well, no doubt, this is kind of an efficacy study of sorts, we wanted to abstract the principles and the features of the Clubhouse that served them the best. And in that sense, we worked on giving shape to their voices. We found that the 21st century skills, the way the Clubhouse promoted those, including technological fluency, were things that carried with them through their lives, through their time in the Clubhouse and subsequently. We also found that the Clubhouse experience gave them capacity to follow pathways to success, and it gave them a sense of commitment to their community and service. And these themes really rang through strongly. They were part of rich life stories and rich descriptions of the experience in the Clubhouse, but they came out strongly. Another, if I may say, shoestring study we did with the Clubhouse was a self-report survey that we did with alumni. We would have wanted to do extensive interviews with as many alumni as we could have found internationally, but we came up in close collaboration, again, with Clubhouse practitioners and leaders. We came up with a survey and asked them all sorts of questions about their experience in the Clubhouse, its influence on their behaviors in the course of their lives. And admittedly, these are alumni who've stayed in touch with the Clubhouse for years past their time in the Clubhouse, and either directly or indirectly, I should say, but they nonetheless were willing to answer the questions of the survey. We can't consider them to be representative of all Clubhouse alumni, but they do shed a little light on the nature of the Clubhouse experience. It was about 200 respondents, and in this little graph here, I just want to highlight, we asked them the question about the different institutional supports they've had and what the outcomes or the impact of those institutional supports had been in their lives. We asked them about staying in school, and that's on the bottom, so I'm reading kind of from the bottom up, and 60% said that that the Clubhouse was the most important factor in helping them stay in school, which is a nice finding. Living a healthy lifestyle right above that, I can't read it, but it's probably 68% said attending college. Pursuing a career, this obviously leads up. 97% of the participants said that the Clubhouse was the most important influence in their lives for setting high goals and expectation for themselves. And it's kind of a moving finding because the nature of these environments create a different kind of experience, one that it just doesn't seem stands out in a salient way in relation to other kinds of institutional supports that youth in the Clubhouse have. We also spent time in clubhouses last year as they were piloting the Start Making program. We were actually looking at Intel's Start Making program in relation to maker fairs. We hung out with Jay Silver, and we're doing a developmental evaluation looking at the characteristics of the activities he was designing and the way they were taken up by folks. But last summer, Intel decided to pilot that in a girls' program nationwide, and we got to do some pretty ethnographic stuff with field notes and interviews. And that work is going to expand in 2014, and my colleague Julie Raymold, who's also here, will conduct the evaluation for that. Now, the question, leaving kind of the Clubhouse work, the question of common approaches comes up. And yesterday I was in a meeting with a bunch of folks at the National Research Council, and somebody said that common measures were really important, and they were really important because they would allow us to compare which programs work better according to those measures, and they would drive the programs to design programs that would turn out in those measures. And I've seen a bunch of candidates for common instruments, and I can't help but think that they're reductionistic, and it would reduce the diversity of the kinds of programming we have. I think what we want instead is a proliferation and expansion of programming types, focusing our attention on any one outcome or set of outcomes really narrows the possibilities of something broader coming out. And I found a statement from the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, 1999, that says that no test will serve all purposes equally well. Choices in test development and evaluation that enhance validity for one purpose may diminish validity for other purposes. And this is a version of what Lewis said in his keynote on Thursday. I also have experience with what's happened in the world of informal science education, where standard categories for outcomes have been offered to the field, mainly through NSF and its its funding stream and work. And I know for a fact from people who were witnessing the impact of this that the nature of the kinds of outcomes that people who were proposing to do informal science education, the nature of those outcomes became quite constrained and much less, as it was put, imaginative and true to the programming that these folks wanted to do. That's actually anecdotal, but we're doing some research right now to try to see if we can find out whether that is true systematically or not. In 2009, there was a committee at the National Research Council that put out a volume, Learning Science and Informal Education, that had a set of what they called strands, and the volume made the point emphatically that these strands were to be considered in an intertwined fashion, that they didn't represent solely outcomes, they represented ways that programs could develop and support youth, that they had to do with the nature of the design of these programs as much as they did with outcomes. But the field took this list and turned it into a list of outcomes, and those lists match pretty well onto the 2008 NSF framework categories, and this has dominated the field and really changed and shaped the way people think. And if I may, I think it's foreclosed possibilities and made it very difficult to do research on the kinds of emergence, serendipity, and improvisation that people in the field otherwise would really be paying attention to, both in terms of their design and their research. One of the other things that's happened is that the informal science education field has gone kind of crazy over the notion of interest. And while everybody in this room agrees that interest is really important, I think we have to wonder if interest is the only thing. I think interest is dynamic and situational, and I think we all agree with that. But interest also, can flip, can turn on a dime quickly, not just in a year, but also in a day. And people fall out of love instantaneously. I mean, these things happen, and we've all experienced. Teachers I've talked to have said that they can get kids interested in anything. Kids don't know what they're interested in. Well, that's debatable. But I think the point is that interest isn't the only critical variable, and I can't tell you how many millions of dollars literally have gone into trying to develop common instruments for measuring interest in this field. I've been myself giving a lot of thought to sort of a framework that would think about experience linked with opportunity, and how experience connects to opportunity in such a way that will allow us to understand the experience of youth, by their words and actions, but more importantly, I think, by what's made available to them in any of the settings they're participating in, and made available to them in terms of materials and tools, language, discourse, relationships, and to think seriously about how they take up those opportunities, how they make those opportunities into something different and unexpected. So moving forward, I think there are a few key principles for the kind of research that would serve, I've got a brush, okay. Serve our purposes. And one of them is really grounding the research that goes forward in practitioners' professional vision, what they deeply understand about the kinds of learning that occur in their programs. I think that's way, way, way underutilized as a source of valid and important data. We have, I think, a tension around the notion of anecdotes, but anecdotes turn into important data when they're used in disciplined and systematic ways to think about the nature of experience for students and linked together. Practitioners have that frontline knowledge that I was just talking about. They understand, I think, intuitively what moments of learning and knowing are for their students, how they orient to those. And I think ultimately, we're able to, as researchers working with practitioners, we'd be able to build schedules for when these critical moments occur and then start to think about how we could collect those and aggregate them. I used to think about aggregating them in textual description, but I think the tools are there to aggregate them visually, both with photos and videos, and to think about the kinds of categories of experience that youth have. We also have this notion of connected opportunities, and I think the metaphor of stepping stones or pathways is one that many of us resonate with or think about at least. And my colleague Tim Podkul, along with Denise Sauerteig, who are here, are working with Art Lab in Washington to look at brokering of connected learning activities, what allows for people to move in and out in meaningful ways. And they are doing a mixed method study using social network surveys of both youth and staff, and doing that along with interviews for qualitative feedback. These are some lovely outputs from SNA that look at both the functional roles of the people in the network and also the kind of the absolute roles, the cultural roles that people have as parents, as staff, in relation to the connected learning activities that youth are engaging in. I think the funnest thing that's going to happen is that youth are going to be given the data and allowed to self-represent, to own that data, to think about their place in their connected learning network and what it means, personalizing and interpreting their network output in art forms. Reminders to ourselves. I think they've come up in the talk, and I'm out of time. And Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you and Craig. Thank you. Oh, I shouldn't close that.
Maybe we can have the presenters and have Craig come out.
Should I?
Yeah, you can close that, I think.
Okay.
So I think in the interest of time and to get some discussion going, we'll just go straight to discussion rather than hearing from Craig and me, but feel free to ask either one of us questions. So I believe there's some mics up here and perhaps some in the back to ask some questions about the two presentations you've heard. And again, feel free to ask Craig and me some, maybe like it's worth us just saying a little bit of our background in the work, and then that way you know what kind of questions to ask us. So yeah, so I'll start and then Craig. So I come at this a little bit from an assessment and measurement perspective, and I liked the quote from Eisner because I see the two things as separate. So one of the things that you can ask me questions about is, how do people in assessment and measurement, think about the kinds of issues that we're facing in our community about how we measure outcomes and so forth. And so I have engaged in a variety of strategies of really trying to take seriously the kinds of theoretical perspectives of what it means to learn in an ecology, learning ecology, but also how experience and opportunity can be measured, as opposed to just the sort of thinking of things like interest as a psychological property, something that just individuals have. So that's in youth participatory research measures. You want to say something?
So real quickly, I think I come at this in a very similar way that Brigid described in terms of trying to understand a lot of the, not only what's happening in the space, but the sort of the broader context around the space as well, and sort of recognizing just how messy learning is, how nuanced the different pathways are, and really trying to be very deliberate, very careful in terms of how we measure and how we go about trying to make sense of how we're both hearing and also seeing data, because that's also what we're doing in addition to the ways that we sort of typically collect data via survey research. But I wanted just to chime in on one sort of key takeaway for me among the many takeaways from both Vera and Brigid's observations. And I know just from conversations that I've had here with people, a lot of you are either invested in these kinds of questions either as practitioners. Just this morning, a couple of really quick conversations I shared with 2 PhD students who are doing dissertations kind of in this area, so who are engaged in research and really trying to think about how they can leverage the kinds of information and sort of knowledge sharing that happens here and take that back to inform their work. But the one question that I would pose to this community, kind of based on what we heard here, is, how are we sort of thinking about these out-of-school kind of informal learning spaces, particularly related to the question of equity? And as I'm listening to these presentations and just sort of thinking about the work that's being done, the work that Nichole has done with DYN, for example, is that we oftentimes don't think of these, well, I think most people don't necessarily think of these spaces as high-stakes spaces. But it's pretty clear to me, right, when you look at how the kids are reporting what these spaces mean to them, the richness in terms of the range of activities that they're engaged in, that these are in fact very high-stakes spaces. So from that perspective, connecting the research to the practice back to the research, and that kind of feedback loop that we see here seems to me to be a very vital contribution that we're making to this conversation. Because my fear is that oftentimes when we think about these kinds of programs when they're made available, particularly to non-dominant communities, that they tend to oftentimes not think about what these spaces could possibly enable, but maybe what these spaces tend to prevent, right? So we oftentimes hear about keeping kids off the streets, this idea of keeping them out of trouble, a very kind of deficit-oriented approach towards what these spaces could potentially mean in young people's lives. And so what I take away from this research, what I take away from the DOIN model, is how we really begin to sort of understand the potential of these spaces, these as possibility spaces, these as critical spaces, as high-stakes spaces that really matter in young people's lives. And as a result of that, doing the research and doing the sort of deep, immersive kind of ethnography that we hear here, just a range of things that I think will likely enrich the work that you're doing, the kinds of interventions that you're making, and hopefully, right, the kinds of impacts that we see these sort of initiatives having.
Let's invite Mimi.
Yeah, so first I really appreciated sort of the research geekery involved in trying to navigate this really complex space of, program evaluation, assessment, documentation, when you're really dealing with a set of tools and frameworks that were, created, a frame that is based on a certain kind of formal classroom practice, and trying to appreciate the specific affordances and outcomes that come from these informal and interest-based learning environments. And so I think these were really important examples of cutting-edge work in that front. But I wanted to just touch on, again, I'm trying to knit together some of the conversations that have been happening in other sessions, and going back to Lewis's provocation on, what are the outcome we really care about, to Craig's point, is equity, right? So it's what we really are looking for is the context change, and measuring kids, measuring program activities. These are all proxies for what we really care about, which is expanded opportunity and equity. And I think one of the challenges of being in the assessment space is that the Baroque nature of how we get held accountable to things really sometimes gets in the way of us having a clear language for charging at the things that we're really trying to charge at, which is expanded opportunity for kids who don't have that right now. And so I appreciated Brigid saying that, there are, and Vera touching on the important issue that, it's actually this really interesting intersection for me between science and activism and advocacy. So what programs need is science, to some extent, that's going to improve your programs, right? You actually really need to know what's happening, what the variability is between kids so that you can target the interventions, what are the features of the environment that are being effective, and that's the science part. But there's this activism and advocacy part that's also really, really critical, and to get those things working together is really, really, a rich problem that I've appreciated from, engaging in this work, but disentangling that and then thinking of, what is the shared sort of outcomes and measures in terms of the advocacy piece that we as a community can line up behind and start getting a shared vocabulary. That, to me, seems to be the critical activist problem that emerges from the deep scientific research that's being put on the table here. And I would really hope that this conversation kicks off, that broader conversation of what is the strategic advocacy and activist project around outcomes that we really need to pursue in order to change the conversation about what counts as a proxy or valuable outcome. So it's a comment, but I'd love it to hear the panel's response to that.
You want to jump in?
Well, I guess I would say, so the sweet spot, I think, when you start doing the qualitative work and trying to describe those moments where new learning activity is emerging, are the places where we might want to work together. I mean, it's going to take a lot more. We described 3 broad categories, but when a new opportunity comes up, like Maurice being invited to give a presentation to teachers, I would call that a pretty interesting consequential opportunity. I mean, there's lots of other examples. We've got lots and lots of cases. Things like a child starting a new business, or deciding to be an apprentice to the church videographer, right? Those end up being consequential because of the connections to adults and also because of the expertise, and they often lead to something else. So it's almost like we need systems thinking, but we need to be able to see and capture and then describe back in a way that's exciting to people who are policymakers and parents what we're seeing. And so those narrative representations are one kind of way. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that we could do. But I think it's at that level. They're near-term outcomes, but and they a lot of people might not recognize them as, oh, so what, he picked up a book? Is that really important? Well, I would say, yeah, that's really important. That's one of those, it would signal to us that something has taken hold and is leading to new opportunities.
I just wanted to quickly say that I think the common discourse in the informal learning field is what do the funders want? And people are in a very reactive mode generally. I think that it's our position to respond to that proactively in an educative fashion to try to really change folks' thinking, change funders and policymakers' thinking about the learning that matters and how you measure that.
So I had 2 thoughts, Mimi, to what you said. I think that what Lewis is talking about in improvement research and what many people here are engaged in with youth participatory research belong to a family of approaches where the science and activism can be integrated. So, Lewis didn't talk about it in activist terms, but it's clearly trying to change the situation and use data to inform that. He's also, talking about some pretty clear metrics, and I think for policymakers, they require a pretty clear and simple signal. So one of the places I go to for taking these guys' perspectives on an ecological perspective and thinking about equity is to really talk about the supports that, and documenting those supports and thinking about measures there. So instead of asking whether kids change their interests every few months, which is actually a bad thing from the standpoint of grit, actually that's a question on the grit, to ask who actually helps you to develop new interests and develop knowledge from that. So that's like just in the survey context. So really asking who's there to support and documenting the supports and saying if we want to hold people to account for something, those are the kinds of things we need to measure. We need to be measuring the systemic connections between institutions that help make new pathways for young people and broaden access to those pathways. So it really matters what our metrics are, because we can only send one or two signals to policymakers about what's important.
Right. Yeah, in the book, we talk a little bit about the idea of inspirational capital. Like, could you actually measure for any young person or group of young people how many people they have that help inspire them, and resources? And if you had a simple metric like that, could you show, for example, in any community, the variability at a regional level that you might see? And could you use that as a way to excite people about the idea of more systemic, regional level design work? And could you show change in that? And I think that would be a complement to what you're talking about.
I like that term a lot, inspirational capital.
So a question. In some sense, I guess the responses right now have been focusing on the audience of policymakers and such. And I think part of one of the conversations we want to have about the role of your work is really the audience of the program developers and designers.
Yeah.
And trying to understand, because oftentimes they might be the activists and who actually need the data, the representation, such that they can be in conversation. So I'm curious how you think about not just the methods, but also the representation of the methods, such that you're also empowering the designers who you're often in conversation with to also be the voice of what's coming out of their programs, and such that the messenger doesn't always have to be the researcher who's doing the study of the work.
I just want to add one comment about that and turn it back to somebody else. But what I think is so interesting is that we assume that teachers or mentors might actually know what the young people are thinking or how they're being inspired. And one of the things that we did find is that young people are variable in how aggressive and articulate they are about what they want to learn. And so we were able to find, and this is where the methodology could be handed over also to other people, but when you start having more systematic conversation, you start finding out things, even from those young people who want to stay on the lowdown. They're not really interested in being the center of attention, but they do have things that are going on, and then that affords the ability to broker a new resource. And so I think we can't assume always, and we know this is true for teachers, they're very busy, they might have no idea what their students are doing after school. It can be similar in the after school space. It's not always going to be transparent and visible. And so that's maybe one direction for thinking about a kind of tool that could help.
I wonder, Nichole, if your question is also, in some respects, points to this issue of translation, right? So how the research, how the documentation, the finding and analysis, how that gets translated back to or in engagement with practitioners and designers. And it seems to me, right, that the example that Brigid gave, the DYN, might be a model for how that might happen, right? So researchers weren't just flies on the wall, kind of observing what was happening, but it sounds like, right, and I know we tried to do this similarly, it's sort of intricately involved in the sort of everyday of that space and of that world. And so as a result, right, there are conversations that will happen between the researcher and the practitioners where they sort of learn from each other, that translation happens so that then the practitioners also are kind of empowered to be able to articulate what's happening, to think about findings. But I like the feedback loop that you sort of articulated. So both were kind of learning from and informing each other, practitioners and researchers. And that dynamic seems to me to be a really interesting one, and one that many of us here might be able to take back to our own respective cases.
Let's throw parents in there too.
Yeah. That's at odds with the paradigm of summative evaluation as well. So it's not going to be a model for generating data and generating findings that every funder or agency that requires evaluation findings is going to completely buy, but hopefully that changes.
But that's what we have to shake up,
right.
Is that a learning environment is a learning environment is a learning environment, even if it's the Clubhouse model or if it's DYN. It is not the same thing.
Right.
Because what is happening is the young people are co-creating the learning experience. And so that's why you see variability. So in the clubhouses, you have lots of variability because you've got different kinds of mentors and different activities, different preferences, but then you also have what happens in between. And so, you know, if we push on, if that's the fact of the matter, then you don't want to be evaluating programs per se without also looking at more complex dimensions.
Absolutely.
Thank you, all of you. This is a terrific discussion. I'm Jim Diamond from the Education Development Center here in Waltham. And listening to you all, I'm also mindful of Cynthia's discussion yesterday about spread and scale. And there's a relationship between those two things and measurement, I think. And I appreciated what I understood you, Vera, to say, that the possibility of measurement forestalling emergence, possibly, but at the same time, we do need measurement, right? And Bill, I also appreciated what you had to say about, you know, who is it that's helping you develop new interest? Who is it that's helping you pick up the book? So I wonder if any of you in your work that you're currently doing, or work that you would like to be doing or see others doing, at the program level, what are the kinds of questions we need to be asking that we can say more about scale? So when we use DYN as an example, what would we like to be able to take from DYN and say, these are the kinds of things within this way of thinking about learning that we want to see represented in other spaces, and then how can we help you develop along those lines?
So I think that requires a kind of collaborative model of research like Lewis was talking about. So one thing is that we're going to assume that variability across the different settings is fundamental. And we're going to try to think about, well, what are the dimensions of variability that matter? And we may begin a cycle of inquiry around, well, we think it's this. So what's the measure for this? And then is that related to an outcome we're trying to accomplish? And I'm being a little vague about this and the outcome because I think that is specific to whether you're talking about a computer clubhouse or whether you're a UMedia site. So those are going to be specific to the model, but you can expect variability within the model. And if you engage in a cycle of inquiry, a goal might be to try to understand, for example, where are the places where this model seems to work? What are the contexts and conditions where this really seems to work? And then to change those contexts. I think Connie gave us that goal yesterday of really thinking hard about what it means to design for changing contexts as opposed to, or actually I think that was Mimi who gave us that idea of changing context as opposed to designing for spread of innovation. So, but using lots of sites and the variability within sites to really understand what about the context do we need to cultivate. So I think we've come to a close, so please join me in thanking our presenters here, Vera and Brigid.
Thank you, Bill.
Don't leave, wait. Yeah. We have some announcements, and David's going to come up.
Good morning, everybody. While we're just getting this sorted out, let me make two announcements before using this opportunity, this moment, to thank the people who made the entire conference possible. You'll notice that over the next 2 months, there will be 2 digital media and learning competitions launching. It was announced yesterday by Rosario Dawson in conversation with Alex Wagner that there'll be a competition launching in April in digital media and learning in conjunction with an organization called Voto Latino, aimed at digital millennials addressing challenges facing, particularly learning challenges facing the Latino community. So that will be the first competition. There'll be about $500,000 worth of awards made for that. And then in roughly mid-May, we'll be announcing really the regular digital media and learning competition, which will be focusing on issues of privacy, trust, learning, and the internet. So watch out for those announcements coming to a screen near you soon. Thank you. It's my pleasure to thank the organizers of the conference. First of all, thank you all for continuing to be here throughout. It's great to see on an early Saturday morning, as cold as it is outside. Maybe we should also thank the polar vortex for not being so polar, right? Making the conference sort of manageable in those terms. But I do want to thank this is not advancing. I want to thank the organizers first and the supporters, the sponsors. First and foremost, of course, the MacArthur Foundation, Connie Yao, Jen Humke, Julia Stash. As I've said repeatedly and in the past, it wouldn't have been possible without the MacArthur Foundation support, their ongoing support, and their leadership in helping us bring this all together. So please, show our gratitude towards them in an unstinting way. The folks at the University of California Humanities Research Institute, where Mimi and I work, the staff will come to address those people by name. And then, of course, the Mozilla Foundation, Mark Sermon in particular, both for hosting the science fair and reception the other evening, that I hope you all enjoyed and benefited from that fair in both senses, both spellings of fair, I guess. And for Mark being a continuing, and the foundation being a continuing supporter of the conference. The conference committee, Nichole in particular, Nichole Pinkard, who has worked tirelessly and been an absolutely indomitable presence for us in herding all of us into getting the program in place and being such a tireless intellectual leader, as well as Elizabeth Babcock, Angela Booker, Eric Gordon, and Philip Schmidt. They put the program together, and I think you'll agree that it's been a terrifically engaging program and continues to be an engaging program. Luis Gomez got us going in a way that drew our attention to some of the key issues we are facing regarding connecting practices and really set the tone for the entire conference. And the plenary speakers, including the folks up here on stage, you can read their names. We want to thank them all again for drawing our attention to the issues that continue to drive us. And of course, all the others who've plugged in over the period. And then thanks to the Fain Group, who've been, this slide is almost the invisible presence, the invisible labor that you don't quite know is being done, but is necessary to the production of any event like this. So Leslie Fain and her group, as well as the folks at the Fairmont Hotel, I think you'll agree that it's been a really comfortable presence, and we want to thank them. And then to the entire DML Hub team, I'm not going to read all the names, you see them all here. More invisible labor, right? We couldn't do this without you all, and we enormously appreciate it. And finally, I want to thank DJ Jeff Brazil, JJ Brazil. Right? I was going to say I'm going to have to talk to him about the music. But that said, we do want to call both Claudia and Nichole up to the stage. This would have not been possible really without their leadership and tireless efforts. We have a little something to show our appreciation of it. Thanks so much.
We have a little Fairmont swag for the ladies.
So thank you all. This will continue through the rest of the day, and we look forward to a discussion at lunchtime about the future of the conference. So we hope you'll join us. Thank you.
Thank you.